Hello, everybody. Bo Hudson here. Oh my gosh, another fantastic guest for us today. And I'm so excited to talk to him. He is a renowned heart surgeon, Dr. Ovadia. Hello, doctor.
Hi, Bo. Nice to be here with you.
So great to have you on board. So you were not in your home state of Florida today. You were traveling, actually doing heart surgeries. And one of the
Correct.
reasons I wanted to have you on today is to talk about the carnivore keto diet and heart health, which is just a real hot topic right now. To get us started, please tell us a little bit about your background, including why you yourself went on a carnivore keto diet.
Sure thing. So, I've been a heart surgeon now for 20 years. And during much of that time, I was a unhealthy heart surgeon.
Mm-hmm.
I have struggled with obesity since childhood. I reached a point about 8, 9 years ago now that I was morbidly obese. I was pre-diabetic, and I realized that I was going to end up on my own operating table, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I was following the path that so many of my patients had followed. I have a family history of heart disease. My grandmother died of heart disease. My dad has heart disease. So I knew I was headed for trouble, but I didn't know what to do about it because I was following the advice that I had been educated to give people about how to avoid heart disease. Eat less, move more, eat a low fat diet. The US dietary guidelines, we're all familiar with it.
Mm-hmm.
And, those guidelines, those recommendations had failed me. And over, I saw them failing my patients. It's not that my patients weren't trying to do these things. They were following the advice, they were taking their medication, and they were still ending up on my operating table.
Mm-hmm.
So, I started to ask some different questions. I came across some different information. And ultimately, I came across the information about low carbohydrate diets, ketogenic diets, and I gave them a try. And I had great success. I lost nearly 100 pounds. And for the first time, I had lost a lot of weight before that many times, but I'd always gain it back.
Right.
Uh, I wasn't gaining it back. And, this is now going back 8 years ago. And here I am, still maintaining that weight loss.
Wow.
And along the way, what I figured out is that our approach to heart disease has really been all wrong. We've gotten it wrong. This focus on cholesterol, and therefore the focus on low fat diets is actually making the problem worse. So I over the past 4 years, as you said, I've maintained a carnivore diet, a meat-based diet, and which goes exactly opposite the advice that we're told for heart health. And
Right.
I'm in the best shape of my life. My heart is in, great shape. I've done extensive testing to make sure of that. And, I've now helped many, many patients to reverse their chronic disease, to, reverse their diabetes, reverse their high blood pressure, lose weight, and stop the progression of their heart disease when they, adopt similar strategies. So that's my focus now, keeping people off of my operating table. I am way too busy as a heart surgeon. Many people will know that heart disease is the number one killer in the United States
Mm-hmm.
and worldwide. It has been that way for 50 plus years, and we're simply not making the progress that we should because I believe we have the wrong focus.
So a lot of people go on carnivore and keto, myself included, because they have the beginnings of, or they have insulin resistance. And I have heard you speak in other programs that insulin resistance is a huge factor in heart disease.
Yeah, so insulin resistance is the true root cause of heart disease. When we look at the statistics, when we look at the studies that we have, we see that insulin resistance is the biggest risk factor for heart disease, way bigger than, elevated cholesterol, which has been the focus of the mainstream medical system for all these years now. And we are not seeing a major impact from lowering people's cholesterol levels with medications or with dietary changes. And I believe the reason that is because cholesterol is a player in the process that leads to heart disease, but it's not what is causing the heart disease. It's not the root cause. And insulin resistance is the root cause of heart disease. And again, we have the studies, we have the data that we need to prove that. It's just that we don't have an easy treatment for insulin resistance. We don't have a medication we can prescribe for insulin resistance. Doctors aren't properly educated about insulin resistance, and therefore it's just not their focus. But when you do focus on insulin resistance, it's amazing the results that you can achieve.
How did we get so lost in the weeds with all this? An example would be up until about 6 months ago, I was watching another program that encouraged you don't eat any meat, no fat, no cheese, no nothing, and pretty much live on plants and oatmeal. I mean,
Yeah.
that's their whole goal. And does that must not be working? And how did we get so lost in all of that?
Yeah, we got lost because when we go back to the 1950s is really when we made the what I now call fatal error. And we go back to the 1950s, the incidence of heart disease was rising dramatically. Our sitting president had a heart attack while in office, and this, of course, set off the alarm bells. And there were basically two prevailing theories of what was causing heart disease at that time. There was the lipid hypothesis, the diet heart hypothesis, as it's now been called, that eating fats, eating saturated fat in particular, and cholesterol in the diet was raising our blood cholesterol levels, and that raised blood cholesterol levels were what led to heart attacks. And the competing theory at the time was that it was actually sugar, primarily in the diet, that was causing the damage to the blood vessels that caused heart attacks. And, for various reasons, some of them were loosely scientifically based. Some of it was, frankly, political. The diet heart hypothesis won out as the prevailing hypothesis. And that then led us down a pathway where we said, okay, we need to lower fat in the diet. We need to lower our cholesterol levels. It led to the U.S. dietary guidelines, which first came out in 1980, that advocated for low-fat diets and avoidance of saturated fat in the diet.
Mm-hmm.
And then right behind it, the pharmaceutical industry came along and developed medications that lowered cholesterol level. And these were felt to be, miracle medications. They were going to eliminate heart disease within 10 years, was the promise. And here we are 40 years later, and we haven't eliminated heart disease. As I said, it remains the number one killer, far and away the number one killer. And our health in general has gotten a lot worse. We have a lot worse diabetes. We have a lot worse obesity. Our rates of chronic disease are much higher than they've ever been. And one thing that I've seen in the 20 years I've been a heart surgeon, which isn't really all that long of a time, the age that heart disease is occurring at is getting younger and younger. When I
Mm-hmm.
started when I started my career as a heart surgeon 20 years ago, it was unusual for me to operate on 50-year-olds. I was operating on mostly 70 and 80-year-olds and some 60-year-olds. Today, I routinely operate on 40-year-olds, and I occasionally end up operating on 30-year-olds. So we're clearly moving in the wrong direction. We clearly haven't eradicated heart disease and won the war on heart disease. Again, that war on heart disease was declared in the 1950s, and here we are 70 years later, and we're not making any progress. And again, I think back then we made the wrong choice. It is clearly sugar, carbohydrates, processed food in general that is driving this epidemic of heart disease. is causing insulin resistance to be rampant in our population. And until we shift our focus to the correct root cause, we're not going to be able to, make headway against this disease.
I want to mention your book before we go too much further. I love the title of it, Stay Off My Operating Table. None of us want to be on your operating table. And I just think that what you have written here on your website, did you know 88% of people are at risk of chronic disease and premature death? Odds are that you're one of them. 88% of people. And that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it is pretty impressive. And, that statistic comes from a study that was released a few years ago, looking at the criteria for metabolic health, what we call. And there were 5 basic criteria. It's your blood pressure, your waist circumference, your fasting blood glucose level, and then your HDL cholesterol level, the so-called good cholesterol, and your triglycerides.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you look at those 5 measures, 88% of the adults in the United States, as of that data was from 2016, did not meet all 5 criteria of optimal metabolic health. So again, only 1 in 10 of us essentially, as adults in this country, are metabolically healthy. And not being in optimal metabolic health is what is setting us up for most of the chronic diseases that plague our society today. It's not just heart disease, it's Alzheimer's disease, it's many forms of cancer,
Mm-hmm.
it's diabetes, obesity, chronic kidney disease. You can go down the list of the top 10 causes of death every year, and 8 out of the 10 of them are attributable to poor metabolic health.
So inflammation is caused by insulin resistance. Is it all over your body, and how does that affect your heart?
Yeah, so inflammation is one of the effects that occurs from insulin resistance. And in particular, that inflammation can occur in your blood vessels, the lining of your blood vessels in your heart and elsewhere. And then what happens is the body responds to that inflammation by sending cholesterol, sending, other types of blood cells to try and basically patch the damage. You can think of the cholesterol as the spackle that you use to repair, the hole in your wall.
Mm-hmm.
And if you keep doing that damage and you keep putting, more and more spackle, eventually you have spackle kind of sticking out of the wall. And that's
Mm.
basically what happens in our blood vessels. And those plaques continue to build up, and those can eventually, cut off the blood supply to your heart and cause a heart attack, or decrease the blood supply to your heart, and lead us to have symptoms like chest pains and shortness of breath that are so common
Mm-hmm.
with heart disease. And this is what causes heart disease. So you can look at that problem and you can say, okay, let's try and lower the cholesterol so there'll be less spackle to put on the damaged wall. But it makes more sense to say, let's stop damaging the wall in the first place, and let's
Mm-hmm.
eliminate the things that damage our blood vessel walls.
Oh, that's
And
fascinating. Yeah.
yeah, so inflammation, insulin resistance, smoking is another big one, that has the same effects. The reason that smoking causes heart disease is because it damages that lining of our blood vessel walls.
Mhm.
But if we eliminate insulin resistance and we eliminate smoking, we're probably talking about 90 to 95% of heart disease that could be prevented.
Wow. Now, when you say prevented, here's my huge question for you. The plaque and everything else that we talk, maybe a small amount of blockage starting. Is it too late to turn that around if you change your diet?
No, it's not. So if we detect this at the early stages, and this is something else that I talk about, that we really want to diagnose heart disease at its early stages. I'm a big fan of a test. It's called a coronary artery calcium scan. It's a pretty simple CAT scan to do. You don't have to even have an IV put in you. Literally takes about 5 minutes. You lay down on the scanner, they do the scan, and that will show us whether or not you have calcium building up in the blood vessel walls of your heart. Calcium, along with the cholesterol, is what occurs in these plaques, in these areas of damage. So we can use that test to detect the disease at its early stages. And that's a test that I think is very underutilized.
Is that the one without the dye?
Correct. Yeah, without the dye.
Wow,
So
that's
pretty
great.
simple to do, and it's a fairly inexpensive test. Most of the time, unfortunately, insurance won't cover that test, but in most areas, you can find a place that does it for under $200.
Can you
Many areas, it's under $100.
give us
So
the
very,
name of that test again? The
it's called
calcium?
a coronary artery calcium scan, CAC scan.
All right.
So big fan of that test. The
Wow.
other thing we need to do is detect insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And that requires, checking your insulin levels, a test that most doctors don't order as part of the routine blood work.
Mm-hmm.
We diagnose people with diabetes when their blood sugar level ends up being elevated. But if we look for it, people's insulin levels will be elevated for up to a decade, maybe even longer, before they develop the diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if you can detect it at the early stages, you can reverse it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so, if you have early stages of heart disease, if you get one of these coronary artery calcium scans and you have some calcium, but not, a huge amount of calcium in your blood vessels, you can make the changes and you can stop it from getting worse. I do see some people that actually improve it. Their score goes down, their blood vessels heal.
Mm.
But even if we don't do that, as long as we stop it from getting worse, if it's at its early stages, then it's not going to lead to, heart attacks and not going to cause people to suffer from heart disease later in life.
So is this what you're describing? Is it more prevalent in older people, say over 60, over 65? And for that group, is it fairly normal for them to have some plaque buildup? I suppose in our culture, we would think it was.
Right.
And is it too late for them, or can they also stop it in the tracks if they change their diet?
No, they can stop it in their tracks. I've worked with 70 and 80-year-olds that have made these changes and had success. Even if you've already have advanced heart disease, if you've had a stent put in, if you've had bypass surgery, with one of my colleagues, or you can still make these changes and you can still stop it from getting worse. Because realize that people who get stents, people who get bypass surgery, it takes care of the problem in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but if they don't change their habits, they still tend to get more heart disease in the future. Very common for someone who has a stent to need another stent or end up needing bypass surgery down the line.
Mm-hmm.
Of still dying of heart disease is unfortunately, the sort of natural course of things, because the stent, the bypass surgery doesn't change the root cause. It doesn't change what led to you getting heart disease in the first place. And if you don't address that, the heart disease is going to continue to build and build.
So would you say that most people who suffer from some kind of heart disease at some point in their life had insulin resistance and eat a crappy diet, eat too many carbohydrates? Is
Yeah,
that
so we actually have studies on this, and they've done studies looking at people who come in with heart disease, come in with heart attacks, and if you test correctly for it, and again, this is the caveat because many doctors don't test correctly for it, but if you test correctly for it, upwards of 95% of patients that present with heart disease have insulin resistance. So, you know,
hmm.
again, we know that this is the cause. We have the data we need on it. we just don't talk about it, within the medical system. Again, it's not something that doctors are educated about. I sort of vaguely remember hearing the term insulin resistance during medical school. And of course, we learned about insulin and what it does, and we learned about diabetes. But we really didn't learn much about insulin resistance. We didn't learn how to test for it, how to evaluate for it. And it was only, like I said, when I went on my own personal journey and I started asking different questions, that I educated myself about insulin resistance. And now, when I know to look for it, again, almost every patient that ends up on my operating table, we can demonstrate that they are insulin resistant.
Wow. Well, your colleagues, I mean, they must just, their mouth must hang open when you start talking about a carnivore diet, which is so much fat and butter and bacon. How do you
Yep.
deal with that? Or is this becoming, is this idea that you have proven, is this now spreading through your community of heart surgeons that they're getting hip to this?
There are very few cardiologists and heart surgeons that are, advocates for low carb, carnivore, keto diets. There are certainly a few, and there were more and more doctors coming on board with this. I go to medical meetings that are focused on these issues: metabolic health, low carb, and I see more and more of my colleagues there from more and more different specialties of medicine there. But this is certainly nowhere near the mainstream. I am very much in the minority. You're right. Many of my colleagues think I'm crazy, quite frankly. I've been called a quack. I've been, attacked online. I'm used to it at this point. I expect it at this point. But my pushback is, are we happy with the results we are getting for our patients? Are we satisfied that heart disease is still the number one killer after, all this focus that we've had on it? And I know I'm not satisfied with those results.
Mm-mm.
I want better for my patients.
Yeah.
And so, I am quite confident at this point that, this is the answer. And I advocate it for my patients. I do it for myself. This, like I said, this isn't a discussion that I'm disconnected from. I have a family history of heart disease, and
Right.
I was headed down that pathway. But I've made my changes. I've seen this work now for countless of the patients that I work with, the huge online community that I interact with, and success story after success story. And so, I don't tell people it's easy. You have to put the work in, you have to make the changes, you have to be willing to make the changes, you have to get out from under the addiction to processed food that so many of us have, because that's what the processed food is designed to do, to keep us addicted to it and make us eat more of it. And so you have to battle against that. And of course, there's lots of messaging that goes against this. And you hear, all the popular, mainstream media sites, they all have articles saying how dangerous keto is for your heart, and, how bad eating meat is. And the
Read that.
reality is,
Mm-hmm.
the data tying the consumption of meat to bad outcomes is very poorly done science and very weak data. And when you really look rigorously at the issue, it's not the meat that's causing the harm in the diet. Yes, meat, a standard American diet, which includes meat, is harmful,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not the meat that's causing the problem. It's
Mm-hmm.
the processed food, it's the carbohydrates, it's the vegetable and seed oils that are in everything these days. And it never was the meat causing the problem. We have been eating meat our entire existence as human beings. For
Mm-hmm.
millions of years on the evolutionary scale, we have been eating a primarily meat-based diet. And heart disease only became a problem within the past 100 years or so. That I think is really all the evidence that we need. But we have plenty of other evidence that eating a meat-based diet, when you eliminate the processed food and when you eliminate the carbohydrates, your health is going to improve.
So do you, doctor, I know this is a personal question, but do you still try to stay keto, carnivore, and in that range?
Yeah, I am, 99% carnivore probably. I
Really?
occasionally have
Hmm.
some non-carnivore items. I might have a baked potato. I might have some avocado once in a while.
Hmm.
I'm human, I'm going to have
Hmm.
ice cream with my kids once in a while.
Right.
But on my day-to-day diet, it is, a carnivore diet. Typically I eat, 1 to 2 pounds of meat of some sort a day. I
Hmm.
include seafood, I include eggs, I include dairy in my diet on a
Hmm.
regular basis. And
Hmm.
like I said, I'm in the best shape of my life.
Hmm.
Uh, I've done all the testing on my heart. I've had the coronary artery calcium scans. I've had two of them now, 3 years apart. I have zero coronary artery calcium. And this is despite the fact that I'm doing basically the exact opposite of what I was trained to do, what I was educated to do.
I'm sure that you teach this to your patients. And while I'm asking you that, I want to give your website. It's ovadiahearthealth.com. And on there, you have a menu where people can choose to take some courses. And you also do, what do you call them? Over the phone or over Zoom calls. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure thing. So ovadiahearthealth.com, or actually you can go to ifixhearts.com, a little easier to spell and remember.
I
Um,
fix hearts.
Yep, ifixhearts.com.
Okay.
ifixhearts is also where I'm at on Twitter.
Okay.
So I have a number of ways that I work with people these days. As you mentioned, I have, courses, online courses that are kind of, self-directed. I have a coaching program where you can work with a couple of fabulous health coaches that are on my team now. And then I have my private telemedicine practice. I see people from across the United States via telemedicine, and we work on metabolic health improvement. We get, amazing results. As I said, I've kind of lost count of the number of patients who have reversed their diabetes, gotten off their medication, reversed their high blood pressure, gotten off their medication. And most importantly, and probably the main issue that I end up dealing with people on, is stopping the progression of their heart disease. So um, uh, you know, I've tried to make this information available to as many people as possible. The point of writing the book was to get the information to as many people as possible. And, I'm very pleased to say that the book has done very well. It's been, #1 bestseller in multiple categories on Amazon. It's won awards. But more importantly to me is the feedback I get from people who, all they do is read the book and then they send me an email and say, I've lost, 75, 100 pounds. I've reversed my diabetes. I reversed my high blood pressure, just from reading the book. And that nothing makes me happier than seeing that.
Okay.
I,
Stay off
I'm,
my operating table is the name of your book.
yep.
And give us a little brief. So, what all do you have in that book? Do you talk?
Yeah.
I'm sure you
So
talk about blood pressure and all these things.
Yeah, so the book is kind of divided into three sections. The first section is kind of the how we got here. It talks about some of the myths that we've been led to believe around our health and around nutrition. It talks about what is metabolic health. How do you how do you figure out if you're metabolically healthy or not? What that means, and then we go into what you can do about it, and we talk about various dietary strategies. We talk about both vegan and carnivore diets. We talk about keto, Mediterranean, all sorts of dietary strategies. And we go through each one and talk about what is metabolically healthy about each one of them and what may not be metabolically healthy about each one of them. Each one of those diets can be used to improve your metabolic health, but there are also potential pitfalls within each one that might not be promoted, helping you metabolically. And then, in the third section, we get into some, kind of day-to-day tips. We give some of the diet plans. I don't really have recipes. I'm not probably the right person to be doing that. There are plenty of great, keto and carnivore cookbooks out there. But I give some sample meal plans. And then I talk about the other things besides the diet that are important, the other lifestyle issues, things like making sure you're getting enough activity in your day,
Yep.
making sure that you're managing your stress and getting adequate sleep. And I also talk about how to find a doctor or another practitioner to work with on this, because you should have a guide through this process. Yes, you can do it on your own, but it's always better to have a coach, a guide that can really, help you through this process.
Because this test that you mentioned, the calcium CT scan, I'm sure you've got to have a doctor that will request that for you.
Yes, that you do need a doctor's order for.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we've just gotten so much information from you, and we didn't touch on the exercise part. So I do have a question about that. There's
Sure.
be a little debate now, whether it's better to just get out and walk and maybe run a little bit versus the hardcore um, aerobicized situation in the gym. I know they're both good for you,
Yeah.
but do you have a rather one that you think people should do now that we're going into spring and summer?
Yeah, so the first thing is, more activity is always better. Doing some
Mhm.
sort of
Doing
activity
something.
versus sitting around is always going to be better.
Mhm.
My priority when it comes to exercise, and I believe, what should be everyone's priority when it comes to exercise, is building and maintaining muscle.
Muscle.
Uh,
Mhm.
so the more muscle that we can build and maintain as we get older, the longer we live and the
Mhm.
better quality of life that we have.
Mhm.
And that is shown in study after study. So I prioritize doing resistance exercise. This can be body weight exercises, things like push-ups, pull-ups, and squats.
Mhm.
This can involve lifting weights. This can involve resistance bands. There are many different ways to get resistance exercise, but build and maintain muscle should be a priority. And then just get as much activity as possible. I talk about simple things, throughout your day. Like, you may notice I'm standing up while doing this podcast. I have a stand-up desk that I work at. Try and take that 10-minute walk after you eat. Does a lot for your metabolic health. So there are simple things, you don't need to spend hours in the gym each day. You don't need to be, doing the running on a treadmill or riding your bike for hours each day. If you like to do those things, if you have time to do those things, it's not that they're not useful or that they're harmful. I just think for most of us who are kind of time constrained, focus on building and maintaining muscle first, and then just get more activity throughout your day.
Okay, great. Well, just such great information and such different advice that we've had our whole lives, especially with the food pyramid. I think bread and rice or something used to be at the top of the food pyramid.
Well, it's at the bottom. It's supposed to be the most, the biggest part. And again, exactly the wrong advice. And
Um,
that's what has led us to where we are.
well, I hope we can all take advantage of it because it sure is different than what we all grew up with. But I just thank you so much for spending this time with me. And I know that my listeners are just going to love everything you said because, I'm trying to stay on the carnivore diet myself. It sure seems crazy to eat bacon and butter and feel okay about it.
Yep. Yeah, but again, we have to look all around us. We have to see the results we've been getting from what we've been doing. And if you're not happy with those results, you got to change. And ultimately, we each have to try these things for ourselves. But in general, I've seen great success from, low carbohydrate, carnivore keto diets, eliminate processed food, and don't fear eating red meat. those are the main messages I give people
From a
around.
heart doctor, from a heart surgeon. Well, thank you so much. And once again, it's ovadiahearthealth.com or ifixhearts.com. I love that. And his book, Stay Off My Operating Table. And of course, that's probably available everywhere, right? Amazon and
Yeah.
wherever books are sold. Okay, Dr. Ovadia, thanks a million. I can't thank you enough for doing this little show with me.
Thank you, Bo.
Hey, much luck to you. Take care.